Hi, we're Project 17, and our project focuses majorly on 1600 to 1700, a period when London was destroyed after the Great Fire of 1666, and planning to reconstruct into a utopian epicenter, both politically and economically. We're interested in investigating what such utopia meant in the context of the society, on questions such as for whom the utopia was constructed, who determined its architectural choices. So in order to answer those questions, our research applied natural language processing methods to analyze semantic trends in digitalized text that we use from early English book online database. Our project was divided into large-scale analysis as well as 2 case studies. So first, we start with the large-scale analysis with topic modeling and word embedding. We use LDA algorithm to fit a topic model and calculate the semantic relationship between top tokens that we generated from the topic model results. From the topic model, we discover Phoenix is used as the metaphor of London, as it is in the same topic bucket with the word London. So by mapping its relationship between king and Christ, we investigate the motivation behind the building of utopia. Our results show that while a utopian society was originally intended to be built for the people, its motivation eventually shifted toward a more political incentive with the approval of more costly projects such as St. Paul's Cathedral. And then we will move toward our small-scale case studies that specifically focus on the code texts that used to found the reconstruction and St. Paul's Cathedral.
So first, we'll be discussing the coal taxes. So coal taxes were passed in multiple installments to help pay for the reconstruction of London, and backlash against coal dues took place from 1687 to 1697. The graph showing positive sentiment provides insight into the general attitude of the upper class in response to backlash. Here, there is a decrease in positive sentiment of words related to St. Paul's, especially after 1650, which could imply that the fire and the reconstruction might have generated backlash, possibly due to coal taxes. The slight increase in positive sentiment of words related to coal and tax throughout the century could imply that writers started depicting coal and taxes in a more positive manner in response to backlash. The graph below showing cosine similarity helps show us what this relatively positive response from the upper class looked like. We calculated the cosine similarity of taxes and houses and taxes in heaven. An increase in cosine similarity between houses and taxes could show an emphasis on economic pragmatism for taxes in contemporary literature, while an increase in cosine similarity between heaven and taxes could indicate that taxes were being portrayed as being used for the greater good to convince people that good could be done with collected taxes.
Next, we performed sentiment analysis and calculated the hapax richness for texts relevant to St. Paul's Cathedral. For sentiment analysis, we extracted 10 words before and after our key terms to analyze, and we used the Bing lexicon, which categorizes words as either positive or negative. Our sentiment was calculated as a proportion of positive tokens to the overall number of sentiment tokens. Looking at both graphs together, though they generally have similar overall trends, during years with key events, they have an inverse relationship. For instance, toward the mid to late 1690s, sentiment was quite negative after nearly 2 decades of taxation. However, hapax richness had an increase. It's possible that the genre of the text could also play a role in how people expressed sentiment. For example, many used poetry as a form of protest, and since poetry is generally more complex than everyday letters or pamphlets, this could correlate with the increase in hapax richness. In the future, we could develop this into a more testable hypothesis relating to the genre of text. A few limitations with our research is that texts by the working class are often poorly preserved and underrepresented, and thus it's possible for texts in our dataset to favor more elite upper class institutions. In addition, the software we use to normalize the spelling of words is not 100% accurate and can also be improved on in the future. However, using what we have to explore the relationships between words, sentiments towards institutions, and the lexical complexity of text can give insight into how themes changed throughout the 17th century and help us further understand the voices included in constructing a utopia. And we can cover any technical questions about our decisions regarding our methods later in the Q&A section. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let's open it up to some questions. If anybody has a question, I think Nicholas does.
No, that was the applause hand.
Oh, the applause hand. Sorry. Yes, but please go ahead. Anybody else? Thomas, please.
Yes, I really interesting what you're doing here. I find it fascinating the methods that you folks are using. Could you talk a little bit about the sources, the texts that you chose to work on, and why you chose those, and your sense of those texts or those sources within the wider set of sources that one could subject to this kind of analysis?
Great. Thank you, Professor Robichaud. I think it's definitely great questions, because one of the limitations that we mentioned before is that the texts that we use are majorly longer book, like pamphlet and books, compared to like smaller lens text. So I think this in some way is definitely going to affect like our results in some way, that it will be mainly focused on the books that are like targeted towards like a smaller scales of audience. So I think this is the like some of the limitation from the early English book online data set. But at the same time, I think it is one of the like widely used texts for that period, because a lot of time like smaller poetry and pamphlet are harder to preserve compared to like more like efficiently published book.
Good.
If I could ask a question, this is Lee in the library. I know when you're dealing with old nomenclature from other centuries or whatever, you know, there's always one of the problems, especially from printing, is the variance in spelling. And I think phoenix is one of those words that it can show up a couple of different ways. I know you thought about this. How did you allow for this in your analysis?
So one of the software that is really helpful to our study, I think thanks to Project 22, we discovered that VARD is a software that can help with normalizing the text into the 21st century, like English that we used to, but at the same time, we also trying to adjust the threshold to make sure that it won't overcorrect certain names and certain words like into the words that they're not intended to. So we use around like 50% threshold, but at the same time, like difficulties of dealing with such tests is no matter how hard we try to normalize it, there's also like one or two words that pop in there that is just like a little bit different. For example, Christ, it is very like frequent that it just appear like CHRI. It might be like an issue with digitalizing printed text, but I think overall we're trying to adjust it using VARD and existed software.
Can I follow up with another one?
Of course.
I'm curious, when you designed this study right there at the beginning, did you have any expectations or any sense of what you might find or what you think you probably would find? And then were there real surprises for you as you began to do the research and finish it up?
I guess I can start. So before we jump into a more technical computational part, we did some reading to really understand the period. And through those reading, we expect that it must be very like a focus must be like religion within the time period. And as we conduct the topic model and computing the word cloud over there, religion does plays a huge part with God as the most frequent word in that time period. But I think something interesting to me is just to see how the monarchy and religions, like how they fluctuate. Before that, I come in with the assumption that religion is like the top priority of that time. But as we investigate further into like which really motivate the Reconstruction, it is interesting to find actually it is monarchy and political power that actually overpowers the religion and become the incentive behind all the projects.
Interesting. And that fits entirely with the Restoration era and getting the monarchy back onto a more stable footing.
I can talk specifically about sentiment analysis. I know that, as Leona mentioned, like before we started on like the technical aspects, we had a lot of readings. And I think for sentiment analysis, there were a couple of dates that we found that pretty much matched up to like what we had expected in terms of like people's sentiment. So like for instance, like 1666, the Great Fire, I think also like 1672 was like the start of the coal taxes. So we could pretty much estimate that like sentiment had like a little bit of a decrease. And then like towards the end, I think it's like 1697, around that time, there was also like a dip after a couple decades of taxes, and then a peak after the chancel was consecrated. So yeah, that was one of the findings that
Interesting.
I think we could have expected.
Interesting. Nice.
I mean, I guess I could talk about like coal taxes. So like the graph showing sentiment analysis, I expected the sentiment for St. Paul's to decrease throughout the century, mainly because later in the century, there were backlashes against coal taxes. So that could be reflected in the decreasing positive sentiment. And I didn't expect tax and coal to have too much of an increase, just because I feel like a lot of the times those words would be explained in like practical or like terms, like just defining like what the tax is in like these texts. But in the second graph showing cosine similarities, like basically how I came to decide like which words to use to find cosine similarities between, that part was pretty interesting because I chose these two words, heaven and houses, because I I ran a code that gave me a list of words that were most common to, or that were most similar to the word tax. And these were two of the words that appeared. So like that was kind of unexpected, but it also like showed like how taxes were being represented at that time.
What part of this project did you find the most challenging?
I guess I can like, for me personally, I think initial stage of data cleaning and learning all the computational part is kind of challenging because we're all new to machine learning and natural language processing. And among those, I think the hardest must be making decisions of what package and what dictionary to use, because even for word embedding, there's so many algorithms. It can be like you can pre-label them or you can just do it unsupervised. So I think a lot of those like decisions, we have to make it quick and we have to like learn everything really quick. That's a little bit challenging, but also I think it's really interesting to have like such broad exposure and have like such like learning pace is very like rewarding as well.
So did any of you have programming language experience at all before this summer?
Ariel, I'm actually going to pause a second. I think Erica wanted to add something about the challenges. So
I'm
I am
sorry.
particularly curious to hear from
I am too,
everybody.
yes, please. I'm sorry, Erica, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, sort of similar to Leona, I also thought like data cleaning was pretty challenging. I think like working with like really large sets of data, it takes a long time to process. So we had to like split that between the three of us. And then also just a lot of the texts, or I guess the original files that we had, they had like different formats for certain files. So we also had to take that into consideration, just like processing everything, and then also like including like the exceptions. Oh, I guess to the like your previous question, I took comp sci last semester and the semester before, so a little bit, but not too much.
Did you use programming languages often or much? Get comfortable at all? I'm always curious to see how much people have had to just kind of learn from scratch, like a whole new thing they've never done before. Happens a lot. So.
Yeah, personally, I worked with Python a little bit, and then I knew a bit of R, but I think a lot of the things that we used for like our project, I had to like learn online and like find different resources. So.
What the rest of you?
I took comp sci classes before because I'm a stats major, so I'm more familiar with R, not so much with Python and Java. So for the program, I think I used like majorly R, while I believe Erica and Audrey use some part of Python. But for R, I never used R to do machine learning and to deal with like a large data set. So I think that part is quite new to me.
Yeah, my programming experience is just limited to one semester of comp sci, where I like learned Python, and Python was a language that I used to primarily clean the text and also run cosine similarity and word embedding. And before this program, I didn't have too much experience with R, but I feel like I definitely learned how to use R throughout this program.
Mm-hmm. So with the skills you've learned this summer, what's next?
I'm actually quite excited about the project, and I am going to extend it into an independent study next semester. And also this project made me realize how much I like machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I just declared my major within comp sci that concentrate in such area. So I'm really appreciate that I did this project this summer.
Oh, that's fantastic. Great.
That's wonderful. That's great. That's really great.
Anyone else?
I haven't declared my major or anything like that yet, but I'm also like considering computer science more now.
Awesome.
I guess like before this project, I was deciding whether I should minor in stats. And I feel like this project really showed me like everything that you can do with data analysis and data science. So like that played a role in like me like determining whether I wanted to minor in stats.
I'd like to actually ask a question. So I know Leona is a MedRan minor, and Erica had a class with me, and we read some early modern stuff together. But Erica and Audrey, what was sort of historically the most surprising thing or most interesting thing that you learned this summer?
I think for me personally, I know since we read a lot of text about architecture, I think like learning about architecture from like a more historical perspective, and also thinking of like the different influences was like really interesting. I know we focused a lot. There's like the one reading I think that we had on like the orders or like the columns, and I found that really interesting, just because like it wasn't something that I had like considered before, and I like didn't think I was gonna read that over the summer. But yeah, it was really interesting for me.
I think the most interesting thing for me was like one of the readings that was about religion and how like both the Protestant and Catholic churches try to like manipulate their history and like in order to be able to call themselves like the primitive or origin church. And I found that to be really interesting, even though like we didn't end up incorporating it into our project.
Mhm, mhm.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Can I put Nick on the spot very briefly?
Of course.
Nick, you're in musicology as a graduate student in the music department, and I sort of I was going to say strong armed, but maybe that's not the right word. I recruited you for this project, which is close to your dissertation. How did it turn out for you? Is it different from what you expected, or more or less what you expected as an experience working with these three amazing students?
Yeah, definitely. I think between the opportunities that you've been offering, Dr. Juni, with Data Plus in the past, and having Data Plus allow more of these sort of historical projects to be offered throughout the summer, it's been really interesting to see how this kind of data analysis can correspond with conclusions that either align or do not align with current historical knowledge that are more analog and specific text oriented. So in terms of a lot of the conclusions, I would say that, I think watching Erica, Audrey, and Leona get to some of these conclusions was, not necessarily a surprise in the end, because there are many ways to look through these kinds of topics, but the way that they did that was just so inventive, and to think very creatively about data in this way, and to sort of look at the large scale, it's very inspiring, and not at all something that I could have done on my own. So just for the three of them to take on this kind of depth of analysis and depth of historical research, it's really difficult to do in 10 weeks. And so I think that they did a great job, and this is original research that, they themselves have created. And so this can go very far, I think, in academia.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we've got a few minutes left if anyone else has any questions.
Any question from the consumerism group? You guys should know these groups work very well.
I guess I had a question not from the poster, but I think one of the slides you were sharing, I think you talked about type. So for you guys, how did you identify, I guess, the various genres? Was it solely based on the length of the text?
Yeah, because the EEBO database is not labeled of what genre the text is, so I think the simplest way for us to identify type is just by the length. Poetry or like shorter text might be less than like 1,000 words, but like longer book, longer pamphlet might be like larger than 5,000. So I think this is like a way that we classify genre for now, but it is like it's not like the most accurate way to do that. So this is like the limitation of the database, as well as possible next way of to see like if there's like a way to write a code to identify what genre it is. But yeah.
Yeah, I know Dr. Junie also mentioned, I think at our last meeting, that hapax richness could also sort of possibly like have a role in like thinking about genre. I guess like for poetry, like generally, I guess we could assume that poetry has higher hapax richness if it's like more dense and complex than like regular books or pamphlets. So yeah, that could also be interesting to factor in with the length of the text as well.